The good life in Paris, music, culture, and appreciation of its rich heritage and fine architecture is easy to take for granted. But today's freedoms and a government that seems passionate about its people's needs didn't come to France without a struggle. And the pinnacle of that struggle, an epic event that reverberates in the spirit of its people to this day, was the French Revolution.
The symbolic launch pad of the French Revolution was a notorious prison called the Bastille, which stood on this square. In 1789, angry Parisians stormed it, released its prisoners, and tore it down. It's one of Europe's great non-sights. There's nothing left to see.
While Parisian back lanes feel peaceful and content today, during times of revolution, they hid hotbeds of discontent. Before French political leaders learned the wisdom of subsidizing the cost of baguettes, hungry peasant mobs would set up barricades in narrow lanes like these.
Generals, like Napoleon, were fond of quieting the streets by loading chains and nails into cannon and giving the malcontents what they called a whiff of grape shot.
Later, the government commissioned Baron Haussmann to modernize the city. He ripped up most of medieval Paris and created the city's grand boulevards.
Great city planning, but really, it was great military planning. Heavy artillery and grand armies worked better with long, broad streets as battlefields. Paris was made easier to rule and more elegant.
Today, like a citywide game of connect the dots, wide Parisian boulevards lead to famous landmarks, like the Pantheon, the Old Opera, the Arc de Triomphe, and the Hôtel des Invalides. Built by Louis XIV in the 1600s as a veterans hospital, this massive building now houses Europe's greatest military museum. And at its center, under a grand dome which glitters with 26 pounds of thinly pounded gold leaf, lies the tomb of Napoleon. It's hard to imagine a building dedicated to a mortal that's more impressive. Gazing at Napoleon's tomb, I love to ponder the story of the charismatic leader who took France from revolutionary chaos to near total dominance of Europe, and then, catastrophically, to near ruins.
Just a humble kid from Corsica, Napoleon Bonaparte went to military school here in Paris. He rose quickly through the ranks during the tumultuous years of the Revolution. By 1799, he was the ruler of France. After that, within 5 years, France had conquered most of Europe, and Napoleon declared himself emperor of it all.
As the head of France's grand million-man army, he blitzed Europe. His personal charisma on the battlefield was said to be worth 10,000 additional men. Imagine Napoleon the Emperor, all of Europe at his feet. The laurel wreath, the robes, and the Roman eagles proclaim him equal to Caesar. As emperor, he worked feverishly to implement the ideals of the revolution into a well-designed and modern society. Probably no single individual destroyed so much and yet built so much. To this day, the French remember Napoleon for his legacy, infrastructure, education system, and legal code. But ultimately, his megalomania got the best of him. Napoleon invaded Russia with the greatest army ever assembled and returned to Paris with a frost-bitten fraction of what he started with. 2 years later, the Russians marched into Paris, and Napoleon was deposed.
After a brief exile on the Isle of Elba, in 1815, Napoleon skipped parole and returned to France, where he bared his breast and declared, "Strike me down or follow me." For 100 days, the people of France followed him, until finally in Belgium, Napoleon was defeated once and for all by the British at Waterloo. Exiled again, Napoleon spent his final years on a remote island in the South Atlantic until he died in 1821.
The Arc de Triomphe was finished just in time for the funeral procession that welcomed Napoleon's body home from exile in 1840. The arch is a memorial to France's many military campaigns, and is particularly stirring on national holidays when it flies the French flag. The Latin Quarter is the core of the left bank, as the south side of the Seine River is known. This has long been the city's university district. In fact, The University of Paris, a leading university in medieval Europe, was founded here in the 13th century.
Back then, the vernacular languages, like French and German, were crude, good enough to handle your basic needs. But for higher learning, academics, like this guy, spoke and corresponded in Latin. Until the 1800s, from Sicily to Sweden, Latin was the language of Europe's educated elite. And Parisians called this university district the Latin Quarter because that's the language they heard on the streets.
Today, any remnant of that Latin is buried by a touristy tabbouleh of ethnic restaurants. Still, it remains a great place to get a feel for the tangled city before the narrow lanes were replaced by wide modern boulevards in the 19th century. The scholarly and artsy people of this quarter brewed up a new age, Paris's café scene. By the time of the Revolution, the city's countless cafés were the haunt of politicians and philosophers who plotted a better future as they sipped their coffee. And the café society really took off in the early 1900s as the world's literary and artistic avant-garde converged on Paris. In now famous cafés along Boulevard Saint-Germain and Boulevard Saint-Michel, free thinkers like Hemingway, Lenin, and Jean-Paul Sartre enjoyed the creative freedom these hangouts engendered.
With its cafe and university scene, Paris had long been a launch pad for bold new ideas. In the 18th century, groundbreaking political and social thinking by French philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau ushered in the Age of Enlightenment. Later, this Enlightenment provided the French Revolution with a philosophical basis, and it gave the American Constitution many of its basic principles.
Paris honors its intellectual and cultural heroes with tombs and memorials in its neoclassical Pantheon. It looks like an ancient temple, but it's only about 250 years old, from the time of the Enlightenment.
During the Enlightenment and the Age of Revolution which followed, everything was subjected to what was called the test of reason. If it wasn't logical, it was tossed out. Nothing was sacred. The very notion of royalty was challenged, and churches were turned into temples of reason.
Even the use of city land for cemeteries, as you learn at the catacombs of Paris, was rejected. The sign reads, "Halt. This is the Empire of Death." It kicks off a 1-mile hike you won't soon forget. The anonymous bones of 6 million permanent Parisians line former limestone quarries deep under the streets. In 1785, Paris decided to make its congested city more spacious and sanitary by emptying the cemeteries, which traditionally surrounded churches, into this labyrinthine ossuary. For decades, priests led ceremonial processions of black-veiled, bone-laden carts into the quarries, where the bones were carefully and artistically stacked as much as 80 feet deep. Each transfer was finished with a plaque identifying from which church the bones came and the date they arrived. While there is history in dem bones, the Carnavalet Museum, filling a lavish old aristocratic mansion, is the best place to sort through the story of Paris.
Pre-revolutionary France had a government by, for, and of the wealthy. And as the rich got richer and richer, people who lived in fabulous mansions like this became blind to the growing gap between the haves and have-nots in their country.
Louis XIV, aka the Sun King, was the ultimate king back when people accepted the notion that a few were born to rule and be rich, while most were born to be ruled and taken advantage of. Room after room shows the opulence of the upper classes in the age leading up to the Revolution. Louis XIV, who enjoyed the luxury but anticipated trouble, said, "Après moi, le déluge." After me, the flood. The heart of the museum features that deluge, which hit when this man, Louis XVI, was king. The French Revolution was kicked off with the storming of the Bastille prison. Supporting the angry masses, the liberal wing of the government took matters into its own hands, declaring it wouldn't quit until the people had a constitution. It was Vive la Nation, Liberté, Égalité, and Fraternité, until the people literally beheaded the king and queen.
The Place de la Révolution, or Revolution Square. It was here that the newfangled guillotine, considered a humane form of execution in its day, was set up. And it was here that Marie Antoinette, Louis XVI, and over 2,000 others were made a foot shorter at the top.
According to this painting, it took 3 to run the guillotine, 1 to manage the blade, 1 to catch the blood, and 1 to hold the head, in this case of Marie Antoinette, up to the crowd. Today, Paris's vast Revolution Square is called Place de la Concorde, Place of Harmony. The guillotine is long gone, and its centerpiece is an Egyptian obelisk.
The king and queen were beheaded by a stark and egalitarian government, but the French love of fine living couldn't be kept down. The 19th century was a boom time for Paris. The entire city was beautified with grand new boulevards and fancy architecture. It was an exuberant age of money. If you had it, you flaunted it.
From the Place de la Concorde, the Champs-Élysées, once a royal carriageway, now Europe's grandest boulevard, leads to the Arc de Triomphe. The arch was dedicated to the victory of the people and their republic, the triumph of French nationalism. The Seine River splits the city into the right bank and the left bank. Its 2 islands mark the center of the Old Town. Most of the essential sites lie near the Notre Dame, between the Eiffel Tower, the Latin Quarter, and Montmartre, the city's highest point.
The Eiffel Tower was built in 1889 to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution and to show off at a World's Fair. It was a muscular symbol of the industrial age.
To a generation hooked on technology, it was the marvel of its day, trumpeting progress and man's ingenuity. This 900-foot-tall tower has 3 observation levels. The higher you go, the more you pay. For me, the middle level is plenty high. Thousands of iron bars and millions of rivets, all assembled in just over 2 years. Today, it stands tall, an exclamation point symbolizing the proud, independent spirit of the French. The Trocadero Square across the river is the place to view the tower and to check out a colorful scene. Parisians own their city. In fact, twice a week, streets are closed and thousands turn out to roll through their city in an exuberant celebration of life. Paris was born centuries before Christ, right here on the Île de la Cité, an island in the middle of the Seine River. The Romans conquered the local fishing tribe and set up camp. Today, the Notre Dame Cathedral marks the place where a Roman temple once stood. The city's first bishop, St. Denis, holds his head in his hands. When Christianity began making converts here, the pagan Romans beheaded him. But, according to legend, Denis just picked up his head and kept on going. Inspired by this miracle, Christianity flourished, and the temple was replaced by a church. Imagine the faith of the people who built this, breaking ground in 1163 on a building which wouldn't be finished for 200 years. Gothic architects incorporated the latest technology, flying buttresses, to support the heavy rooftop. Its ghoulish gargoyles multitask. They serve as fancy rainspouts and scare away the evil spirits. The church is dedicated to Our Lady, or Notre Dame. Mary cradles the baby Jesus. The rose window provides a majestic halo.
The Virgin Mary was highly revered throughout the Middle Ages. The faithful petitioned her in times of trouble for both comfort and, through her intervention, God's mercy.
As worshippers headed for Mass, they'd walk under a relief of Judgment Day. Christ sits on his throne, the trumpet sounds, all are judged: peasants, knights, nobles, royals, even bishops. An angel weighs cute little souls while cheating demons yank on the scales. The saved stand happily at Christ's right hand. The damned, a sorry chain gang, are on his left. Carvings like that, and like this scene of Eve tempting Adam with an apple, remind us that this art was more than decoration. These images reinforced the stories people learned in church. While the church is dedicated to Mary, the rest of Paris seems dedicated to regular Parisians. The old center, with its 2 islands in the middle of the Seine, retains a charming elegance. The Île de la Cité is laden with historic sites. But the little Ile Saint-Louis, connected by a pedestrian bridge, is laden only with the delights of good living.
Arnaud.
Oh, Rick.
Ça va?
Ah, bien.
I'm rendezvousing with my Parisian friend and fellow tour guide, Arnaud Servignat.
Great island.
Yeah, this is the Ile Saint-Louis, Rick.
Ile
I
Saint-Louis.
love this place. You know, all around, it is really uniform architecture, everything dating from the 17th century. And the beautiful apartments, very expensive. It's the most expensive in town. And I wish I could have an apartment here if I could afford it.
This is very trendy to live here.
Oh my God, wonderful. And all along the street, you've got some galleries, quaint, you know, little boutiques and restaurants. And just down the street there's a place, Bertillon, where you have the best sorbets in Paris.
Really?
Yeah. Yes, the island is charming, but the whole city of Paris is charming. In fact, it faces the River Seine, and the River Seine has been called by Parisians the mirror of the city.
It's a great people zone.
Yeah, you know, people strolling,
Coming out.
wandering around,
Festivals
bicycle. Yes, indeed. On the Bastille Day, we have a big party here, big dancing organized,
Dancing,
and people dancing all around the place.
And today it's just so relaxed. So what is the French word for these little stalls?
Bouquinistes, we call them. It comes from the name bouquin, which means it's old French.
Okay. So old books in Old French.
Old books, yes. And they sell prints, you know.
And it goes back a long
magazines.
time?
Oh, back to the 1600s, yes, indeed. They were, you know, very wild vendors which were all along the river Seine like that. And they had to be regulated in the 19th century because they were so wild.
It's just a classic Parisian thing.
It has the, you know, kind of bohemian lifestyle.